Continuing where I left off, chapter 2. At first, after his return home, Nikolai was pensive and even bored. He was worried by the imminent necessity of going into the stupid business matters for which his mother had summoned him home. To be rid of this burden as quickly as possible, on the third day after his arrival, angry and scowling, and ignoring Natasha's question as to where he was going, he marched off to Mitenka's lodge to demand an accounting of everything. Just what he meant by an accounting of everything, Nikolai knew even less than the terrified and bewildered Mitenka. The conversation and Mitenka's accounting did not last very long. The village elder, a delegate from the peasants, and the village clerk, who were waiting in the passage, heard with awe and delight first the young count's voice, booming and snapping in a constantly ascending scale, and a flood of abusive, terrible words one upon another. Robber! Ungrateful wretch! I'll hack the dog to pieces! Not dealing with my father now! Plundering us! Scum! Then, with no less awe and delight, they saw the young count, red in the face and with bloodshot eyes, drag Mitenka out by the scruff of the neck, and with great dexterity applied his foot and knee to his posterior at appropriate intervals between words, as he shouted, "Get out! Never let me set eyes on you again, you scoundrel!" Mitenka flew headlong down the 6 steps and ran away to the shrubbery. The shrubbery The shrubbery was a well-known place of refuge for culprits at Otrado. Mitenka himself, returning drunk from town, used to hide there, and many of the residents of Otrado, anxious to keep out of Mitenka's sight, were acquainted with its protective powers. Mitenka's wife and sister-in-law looked terrified, peeped out from their room, where a gleaming samovar was boiling and the steward's high bedstead stood with its patchwork quilt. The young count paid no heed to them, but, breathing hard, strode resolutely past them and into the house. The countess, who heard at once from the maids what had happened in the lodge, was comforted by the reflection that now their affairs would be sure to improve, but on the other hand felt uneasy as to feel the effect of this would have on her son. She tiptoed to his door several times and listened as he lit one pipe after another. Next day the old count drew his son aside and with a timid smile said to him, "But you know, my dear boy, there was no reason to lose your temper. Mitenka told me all about it." "I knew I'd never be able to understand anything in this crazy world," thought Nikolai. "You were angry because he had not entered the 700 roubles. But you see, they were carried forward, and you didn't look at the next page. Papa, he's a scoundrel and a thief, and I know it. And what I have done, I have done. But if you wish, I'll say no more to him." "No, my dear boy," the count felt embarrassed. He knew he had mismanaged his wife's property and had wronged his children, but he did not know how to remedy it. "No, I beg you to attend things. I am old. No, Papa, forgive me if I have caused you unpleasantness. I know less about it than you do. Damn them all, these peasants and money matters." And carrying forward to the next page, he thought, "I used to understand scoring at cards well enough, but this carrying forward business is quite beyond me," he said to himself, and from that time he did not meddle in the management of the family affairs. But one day the countess called her son into her room and told him that she had a promissory note from Anna Mikhailovna for 2,000 roubles, and asked him what he thought should be done with it. "Well, just this," replied Nikolai. "You say it You say it's rest with me. I don't like Anna Mikhailovna, and I don't like Boris, but they were our friends and poor. So this is what I think. And he tore up the note, thereby causing the old countess to shed tears of joy. And after that, young Rostov took no further part in business of any sort, but devoted himself with passionate enthusiasm to what was for him a new pursuit, hunting, which was conducted on a large scale on the old count's estate. Chapter 3. Winter weathered was setting in, and morning frosts congealed the earth saturated by autumn rains. Already the grass was tufted and stood out bright green against the brownish winter rye trodden down by the cattle, and against the pale yellow stubble of the spring sowing and the russet strips of buckwheat. The uplands and groves, which by the end of August had still been green islands amid the black fields and stubble, had turned into gold and crimson islands, into the green winter rye. The hares had already half shed their summer coats. The fox cubs were beginning to disperse, and the young wolves were bigger than dogs. The hounds of that ardent young sportsman, Rostov, were not only in hunting form, but were so worked up that at common council of the huntsmen it was decided to give them a 3 days' rest, and then on the 16th of September to set off on an expedition, starting with the unbeaten oak grove, where there was a litter of young wolves. Such was the situation on the 14th of September. All that day the hounds were kept at home. It was frosty and the air was sharp, but toward evening the sky became overcast and it began to thaw. On the morning of the 15th, when young Rostov in his dressing room gown looked out the window, he saw it was an unsurpassable morning for hunting. It was as if the sky were melting and sinking to earth without a breath of wind. The only movement in the air was the gentle downward drift of microscopic particles of haze or mist. The bare twigs in the garden were hung with transparent drops that fell on the freshly fallen leaves. The earth of the kitchen garden glistened wet and black like the heart of a poppy, and the within, a short distance, melted into damp, murky pall of fog. Nikolai went out onto the wet, muddy porch. There was a smell of rotting leaves. Pardon me. There was a smell of rotting leaves and of dog. Milka, a black spotted bitch with broad hindquarters and large prominent black eyes, got up on seeing her master, stretched her hind legs, and lay down like a hare, then suddenly jumped up and licked him right on the nose and mustache. Another dog, a borzoi, seeing his master from the garden path, arched his back and rushed headlong to the porch, and with lifted tail rubbed himself against Nikolai's leg. At that moment there rang out aloud, "Ahoy!" that inimitable huntsman halloo that unites the deepest bass with the highest tenor. And around the corner of the house came the huntsman and whipper-in Danielio, a gray, wrinkled man with his hair cut straight across his forehead, Ukrainian fashion, and a long bent whip in his hand. His face wore the expression of an independence and scorn of everything in the world that is seen only in huntsmen. Doffing his Circassian cap to his master, he looked disdainfully at him. This disdain was not offensive to his master. Nikolai knew that scornful and superior as this Danielio appeared to be, he was still his man and his huntsman. "Danielio," said Nikolai, with a shamefaced awareness that at the sight of the hunting weather, the hounds, and the huntsman, he was being carried away by that irresistible passion for the chase which makes a man forget all previous intentions. as a lover forgets everything in the presence of his mistress. What orders, Your Excellency? Asked a bass voice deep enough for an archdeacon and a horse from Halloween, and a pair of flashing black eyes looked askance at his master, who was silent. Surely you can't resist it, those eyes seemed to say. A good day, eh? For a hunt and a gallop, eh? Said Nikolai, scratching Mikkel behind the ears. Danilia winked and made no reply. I sent Uvarka out at daybreak to listen, he said, after a pause. He says she moved them into the Ultranum covert. They were howling there. This meant that the she-wolf, about whom they both knew, had moved with her cubs to the Ultranum forest, a small private hunting preserve 2 versts from the house. Shouldn't we go? Said Nikolai. Come to me with Uvarka. As you wish. As you wish. Then put off feeding them. Yes, sir. 5 minutes later, Danilio and Uvarka were standing in Nikolai's big study. Though Danilio was not a tall man, to see him in a room was like seeing a horse or a bear standing on the floor amid furniture and domestic surroundings. Danilio himself felt this, and as usual stood just inside the door, trying to speak softly and not move for fear of breaking something in his master's apartment, and saying what had to be said as quickly as possible so as to get out in the open, away from that ceiling and under that sky once more. After making inquiries and extracting from Danilio the opinion that the hounds were fit, Danilio himself was longing to go. Nikolai ordered the horses to be saddled. But just as Daniel was about to go, Natasha came hurriedly into the room, wrapped in an old nurse's big shawl, not having done up her hair or finished dressing. Petya ran in after her. Are you going? Asked Natasha. I knew you would. Sonia said you were going, but I knew that on a day like this you couldn't help going. Yes, we're going, replied Nikolai reluctantly, for he intended to hunt seriously that day and did not want to take Natasha and Petya. We are going, but only for wolves. It would be dull for you. You know it's my greatest pleasure, said Natasha. How, mean, going by himself, he's ordered the horses, and not a word to us. All obstacles give way before a Russian. Let's go, shouted Petya. But you can't. Mamma said you mustn't, said Nikolai, turning to Natasha. Yes, I'm going. I certainly am going, said Natasha with determination. Danilio, have them saddle for us, and tell Mikhail to come with my hounds, she added to the huntsman. Merely to be in a room seemed irksome and unfitting to Danilio, but to have anything to do with a young lady seemed to him quite impossible. He cast his eyes and made haste to get away as though it were no affair of his, being careful as he went not to inflict any accidental injury on the young lady. Chapter 4. The old count, who had always kept up an enormous hunting establishment, had recently turned it all over to his son's care, but on that day, the 15th of September, being in high spirits, he prepared to go out with the others. Within the hour the whole hunt was at the porch. Nikolai, with a stern and serious air which showed that now he had no time for trifles, walked past Natasha and Petya, who were trying to tell him something. He inspected every detail of the hunt, seeing huntsmen ahead with a pack of hounds to intercept the quarry, mounted his chestnut Don horse, and whistling to his own leash, set off across the threshing floor to a field leading to the Ultranov preserve. The old count's horse, a sorrel gelding called Viflyanka, was led by his groom, while the count himself was to drive in a light gig straight to a gap in the covert reserved for him. 54 hounds were led out by 6 whippers and grooms. Besides the members of the family and their leashes, there were more than 40 borzois and 8 borzel kennelmen, so that in all about 130 dogs and 20 horsemen were in the fields. Every dog knew its master and its call. Every man in the hunt knew his business, his place, and what he had to do. As soon as they had passed the fence, they all spread out evenly and quietly, without noise or talk, along the field and road leading to the alternate forest. The horses move over the field as over a thick carpet, now and then splashing into puddles as they crossed the road. The misty sky still seemed to be descending steadily and imperceptibly toward the earth. The air was warm and still, and there was no sound save the occasional whistle of a huntsman, the snort of a horse, crack of a whip, or the whine of a straggling hound. When they had gone about a verst, 5 more horsemen with dogs appeared out of the mist, coming toward the Rostovs. In front rode a handsome, ruddy old man with a big gray mustache. "Good morning, uncle," said Nikolai, when the old man drew near. "A fair field and a clear course." "I was sure of it," began the old man addressed as uncle. He was a distant relative of the Rostovs, who had a small property near them. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist. Good thing you came out. Fair field, clear course." This was his favorite expression. "Take the covert at once, for my Gurchik say the Ilgins are at Korniki with their hounds. Fair field, clear course. They'll snatch the litter from under your noses." "That's where I'm headed. Shall we join forces?" asked Nikolai. The hounds were united in one pack, and Uncle and Nikolai rode side by side. Natasha, muffled in shawls which did not hide her eager face and shining eyes, galloped up to their accompanied by Petya, the huntsman Mikaleo, and the riding master, who had been appointed to look after her. Petya was laughing at something and whipping and pulling at his horse. Natasha sat raving a ripchik with ease and confidence, effortlessly reining him in with a firm hand. Uncle looked with disapproval at Petya and Natasha. He did not like to combine frivolity with the serious business of hunting. "Good morning, uncle. We're coming too," shouted Petya. "Good morning, good morning. Mind if you don't ride down the dogs," he retorted sternly. "Nikolenka, what an enchanting dog that Trunil is." "He knew me," said Natasha, of her favorite hunting dog. "In the first place, Trunil is not a dog, but a hound bitch," thought Nikolai, and gave his sister a severe look, trying to make her feel the distance that ought to separate them at that moment. Natasha understood him. "You mustn't think we'll be in anyone's way, uncle," she said. "We'll stay in our places and not stir." "And a good thing, little countess," retorted uncle. "Only don't fall off your horse," he added. "Or, Fairfield, clear course, you'll have nothing to hold on to." The Altrincham preserve came into sight a couple of 100 yards ahead, and the whippers in rode toward it. Rostov, having finally settled with uncle from what point they should set on the hounds, and having shown Natasha where she was to stand, a spot where there was no chance of anything running out, rode off to close in from the ravine. "Well, nephew, you're going for a big one," said uncle. "Mind she doesn't give you the slip." "That's as it happens," replied Rostov. "Kara high," he shouted, responding to uncle's remarks by his call to one of his dogs. Kara was a shaggy, ugly old hound, famous for having tackled a grown wolf by himself. All took their places. The old count, knowing his son's ardor in the hunt, hurried so as not to be late, and the whips had hardly taken up their stand when Ilya Atrich, flushed and jovial, his cheeks quivering as he drove his black horses over the green field, arrived at the place on the trail reserved for him. Straightening his fur coat and pulling on his hunting gear, he mounted his sleek, docile Viflyanka, which was turning gray like himself. The horses and gig were sent back. Though not a sportsman at heart, Count Ilya Atrich was thoroughly acquainted with the rules of the hunt, and rode to the edge of the thicket where he was to stand, fix his reins, settle himself in the saddle, and feeling that he was ready, looked about him with a smile. Beside him was his valet, Semyon Chekmar, a veteran horseman now somewhat stiff in the saddle. Chekmar held in leash three formidable wolfhounds, though they too had grown fat like their master and his horse. Two wise old dogs lay down unleashed. Some 100 paces farther along the edge of the wood stood Mika, the Count's other groom, a reckless rider and passionate hunter. The Count had followed the time-honored custom of drinking a silver goblet of mullet brandy before the hunt, and had taken a snack and washed it down with a half a bottle of his favorite Bordeaux. He was somewhat flushed from the wine and that drive. His eyes, inclined to water, were particularly bright, and sitting in the saddle, wrapped up in his fur coat, he looked like a baby taken out for a drive. After seeing to his duties, the thin, hollow-cheeked Checkmar glanced at his master, with whom he had lived on the best of terms for 30 years, and perceiving that he was in a genial humor, looked forward to a pleasant chat. A third person, one who had evidently been trained, rode circumspectly out of the woods and stopped behind the Count. This individual was an old grey-bearded man dressed in a woman's cloak and a tall peaked cap. He was a buffoon who went by the name of Nastasia Ivanovna. "Well, Nastasia Ivanovna," whispered the Count, winking at him, "just you scare off the beast and Daniel will give it to you." "I'm no greenhorn," said Nastasia Ivanovna. "Shh!" hissed the Count, and turned to Simon. "Have you seen Natalia Elenichina?" he asked. "Where is she?" "With Pyotr Ilyitch, behind the Tsar's high grass," answered Simon, smiling. "Though a lady, she really takes no to hunting." "You wonder at the way she rides, eh, Simon?" said the Count. "As good as any man." "Who wouldn't wonder? So daring, so clever." "And Nikolasha, where is he?" "By the Ladyov uplands, I suppose?" asked the Count, still in whisper. "Quite right, sir. He knows where to stand. He understands all the fine points so well that Danny and I are sometimes amazed," said Semyon, knowing what would please his master. "Rides well, eh? Looks fine on a horse, eh?" "A pitcher he is. He made short work of running that fox out of the Zavesky high grass the other day. Come galloping out like a fury, the horse worth 1,000 roubles, and the rider beyond price. Yes, one would have to search far and wide to find the likes of him." "Far and wide," repeated the Count, obviously disappointed that Simon's praises ended so soon. "Far and wide," he said, turning back the skirts of his coat to get at his snuff-box. "The other day, now, when he came out from mass in full regalia, Nikolai Sidorovitch," Simon broke off, having clearly heard on the still air the rush of the hounds, with no more than two or three giving tongue. He bent his head, listening, and shook a warning finger at his master. "They're on the track of the litter," he whispered, "making straight for the Lachadov uplands." The Count peered out of their shelter into the distance, the smile still lingering on his face, and forgetting to take a pinch from the snuff-box in his hand. The baying of the hounds was followed by the bass note of the hunting call for a wolf sounded on Daniel's horn. The pack joined the first three hounds, and could be heard in full cry, with that peculiar decoy howl that indicates they are running a wolf. The whips were no longer hallooing, but sent on hounds with a cry of "Ulia, Ulia, Uyu, Uyu," and Daniel's voice, now a deep bass, now piercing shrill, was heard above the others. It seemed to fill the whole forest and beyond, echoing far away in the open country. After listening for a few seconds in silence, the Count and his groom felt certain that the hounds had divided into two packs. One, the larger, was going off into the distance in full cry. The other was flying along the wood past the Count, and it was with this pack that Daniel's "Ulio, Ulio" was heard. The sounds of both packs mingled and broke apart again, but both were becoming more distant. Simeon sighed and stooped down to straighten the leash in which a young hound had caught his leg. The Count also sighed and noticed the snuff-box in his hand, opened it, and took a pinch. "Back!" shouted Simeon to a hound that was stalking out of the thicket. The Count started and dropped his snuff-box. Nastasia Ivanovna dismounted to pick it up. The Count and Semyon were looking at him. Then, in a flash, as often happens, the sound of the hunt drew near, and the baying of hounds and Danielo's "Ulia, Ulia" seemed to be right in front of them. The Count looked up, and on his right saw Mika staring at him with eyes staring out of his head. Lifting his cap, he pointed ahead and to the other side. "Look out!" he shouted in a voice that showed the words had long been on the tip of his tongue, and he could hardly wait to utter them, and letting the dog slip, he rode toward the Count at a furious pace. The Count and Simeon galloped out of the thicket, and on their left saw the wolf lopping along at an easy gait toward the very spot where they had been standing. The ferocious dogs whined, and pulling free of the leash, rushed past the horses' hoofs after the wolf. The wolf stopped in his tracks, awkwardly like a man suffering from quinsy. It turned its broad bow head toward the dog, and still with the same rolling gait, gave a couple of bounds, and with a swift of its tail disappeared in the thicket. At the same instant, with a cry resembling a wail, there sprang out of the opposite thicket first one hound, then another, and the whole pack flew across the open field toward the very spot where the wolf had disappeared. The hazel bushes parted behind the dogs, and Danilo's horse appeared, dark with sweat. On his back sat Danilo, hunched forward, capless and disheveled, his gray hair hanging over his flushed, perspiring face. "Ulio, Ulio, Ulio, Ulio!" he cried. When he caught sight of the Count, his eyes flashed lightning. "You!" he roared, shaking his upraised whip at the Count. "You let the wolf slip! What sportsman!" And as though scorning to waste more words on the startled, shamefaced Count, he lashed and heaving flanks of his sweating chestnut gelding, with all the fury provoked by the Count, tore after the hounds. The Count, like a chastened schoolboy, looked around with a smile, appealing to Semyon for sympathy in his plight. But Semyon was not there. He had galloped off along the edge of the bushes to cut the wolf off from the covert. The field too was coming up on both sides, but the wolf got into the bushes, and not a single hunter managed to intercept it. And I'm going to leave it off there. Thank you so much for watching and continue to watch. You don't have to subscribe, but if you want, you can give it a thumbs up, a thumbs down. Definitely leave a comment below. You do nothing, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.